The wind cut through the valley like a cold blade, carrying with it the sharp scent of iron and ice. The human had walked this path many times before. But today, something was different. In the middle of this dry and frozen land, there was a river. It should not have been there. The maps showed no water, no streams, no lakes. Nothing but rock and snow for hundreds of miles. Yet here it was, a wide, fast, and violent rush of black water tearing its way through the land as if it had been here for centuries. He stood on the edge, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The water roared below, carrying chunks of ice the size of his head. It was strange. No snowmelt should be feeding it. No underground spring could be this strong. It was as if the river had appeared overnight, and in a way, it had, last week. The ground here was solid, frozen, and lifeless. Today, it was alive with noise and danger. He adjusted the strap of his rifle and crouched, touching the icy edge. It wasn't just cold, it burned like acid. He pulled his hand back quickly, wiping it on his coat. The smell was sharp, metallic, almost like blood. His gut told him something unnatural had caused this, and on this planet, unnatural usually meant dangerous. A sudden sound cut through the rushing water. Faint, almost swallowed by the roar, he froze. It wasn't the sound of water or wind, it was a voice, a high, weak cry, barely there. He scanned the far bank, but saw nothing but dark rocks and swirling ice. Then, movement. Something small, struggling in the current. At first, he thought it was just debris, but then it turned. And he saw a face. It was pale blue, framed by tangled strands of silver hair. Two huge black eyes were wide with panic. Locking onto him for just a second before the water pulled her under. He didn't think. The rifle dropped from his hands. And he ran. The ground was slick, and the cold bit into his legs as he leaped from the bank into the river. The shock hit him like a hammer. The water felt alive, like it was trying to crush his chest. Every breath was a fight, every movement heavy and slow. But he forced himself forward, eyes fixed on the small shape thrashing in the water. She surfaced. For a moment, coughing and clawing at the current. Before being dragged under again, he kicked hard, arms slicing through the icy black, lungs screaming for air. His fingers brushed fabric thin and soaked, and he grabbed hold. The river fought him, pulling at both of them. It wanted to keep her. He clenched his jaw and pulled, using every bit of strength to push toward the shore. His boot scraped something solid, a rock ledge under the surface. With a final heave, he dragged them both onto the bank. Collapsing on the wet ground, gasping for breath, she lay still beside him. Her chest unmoving, panic spiked through him. He turned her gently, pressing his ear close. No breath. He began chest compressions, counting in his head, willing her to breathe. Then, a weak cough. Water spilled from her mouth, and she sucked in a sharp, desperate breath. Her eyes opened black and endless, and they locked on his face. She whispered something in a language he didn't know, voice trembling. And then she went limp, unconscious but alive. He sat there, holding her against him, staring at the impossible river. Whatever had brought it here, it had almost taken her, but now she was in his arms. Small and fragile, and he had no idea that saving her would change everything, because on her world, a life saved was a life claimed. And to her, in this moment, he was no stranger. He was hers, forever. The human's cabin was small, built from scrap wood and salvaged metal. Standing alone on the edge of the frozen forest, he pushed the door open with his shoulder, still holding the tiny alien girl wrapped in his coat. The heat from the small stove washed over him, a welcome change from the biting cold outside. He laid her gently on the narrow bed, the blankets swallowing her small frame. Her skin was still cold, almost icy, and her lips were faintly purple. He poured water into a tin cup, set it near the stove too warm, and then knelt beside her for a moment. He He just looked at her. Her features were unlike anything he had seen up close. Her pale blue skin seemed almost translucent, the faint outline of veins visible beneath. Her silver hair clung in wet strands to her cheeks, and her long lashes trembled slightly with each shallow breath. He didn't know her name, her story, or even if she could survive the night. But something in him, something deep, refused to leave her side. He took one of her small hands into his. It was so light, so delicate. Yet when he shifted, her fingers twitched, as if holding him tighter, even in sleep. Hours passed. The wind outside howled against the walls, and the fire in the stove crackled. At one point, she stirred, her eyelids fluttering. Her gaze landed on him instantly. As though she had been searching for his face the moment she woke, she whispered something. Soft, breathy, but the words were alien to him. It sounded like Kyrene, though he couldn't be sure. He offered the warm cup of water, and she took it with trembling hands. Her fingers brushed his. And she didn't pull away. Instead, she seemed to hold the contact, as if afraid it would vanish. She drank slowly, her throat moving with each sip. Before handing the cup back with a small nod, he decided to try talking. Speaking slowly, "You're safe now?" he said. She tilted her head, clearly not understanding all of it, but when he pointed to her, then to himself, and tapped his chest, she seemed to think hard. Her lips formed a word, the same one she had said at the riverbank. He repeated it, clumsily. She gave a faint smile, almost shy. Later, as the night deepened, she kept her eyes on him, even when he moved across the room to stir the stove. Her gaze followed him like a shadow when he returned to sit beside her. She reached out and took his hand without hesitation. She spoke again in her own tongue. He didn't need to understand the words to feel the meaning: gratitude, trust, and something heavier. The more he looked at her, the more questions filled his mind. How had she ended up in that deadly river? Where had she come from? And most of all, who was she running from? The flicker of fear in her eyes when she glanced at the door gave him a clue. She wasn't just lost, she was hiding. And not from the weather. She curled against the blankets, her head barely reaching the pillow. Her breathing steadied, but her grip on his hand never loosened. It was as though letting go might mean waking up to find herself alone again. He stayed beside her, the firelight casting shadows across the walls. Every creak of the cabin made him glance toward the door. Something told him that whatever trouble had put her in that river might still be out there in the stillness. She began humming a low, melodic sound that made the air feel warmer. It wasn't random. It was a song, slow and haunting. He didn't understand the words, she softly added, but they carried an ache, a longing for safety, for belonging. When she finally drifted into deep sleep, he sat there a long while. The fire's glow flickered across her face, highlighting the sharp yet gentle lines of her alien features. She looked fragile, breakable even, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she had endured far more than she let show. He knew one thing with certainty. This wasn't just about saving her from drowning anymore. Something bigger was coming, something that would test every promise, every ounce of strength he had. And though he didn't understand her world, her laws, or her language, he understood the way she had looked at him, like he was the only anchor she had left. By morning, the snow outside had stopped falling. But the strange tracks in the frost, the ones he hadn't noticed before, told him their quiet night was almost over. Whatever had chased her to that river was still moving, still hunting, and now it would find them both. The human woke to the faint sound of movement. The fire in the stove had burned low, and the cold of the early morning crept into the cabin. He rubbed his eyes and sat up, looking toward the bed. The small alien girl was awake, sitting quietly, her knees pulled to her chest. She was watching him with the same steady gaze she had kept since the moment she'd opened her eyes the night before. When he moved to add more wood to the fire, she suddenly spoke. Her voice was soft but clear. the words halting as if she was shaping each one carefully. "You save me," she said. He paused, surprised that she was trying to speak his language. "Yes," he said slowly. "I pulled you from the river." Her eyes didn't blink. "You saved me," she repeated, placing her hand on her chest. Then she pointed to him and said, "Now I am yours." He frowned, unsure if he'd heard right. "That's not how it works," he said gently, trying to smile. "You're free. You can go wherever you want." But she shook her head, her silver hair catching the firelight. "No," she said firmly, "not free. You saved my life. Now my life is yours." He didn't understand. "What do you mean?" he asked. Her dark eyes softened, and she leaned forward a little, as if telling him a secret. "In my people's law," she said slowly, "when one is dying and another saves, they belong to the Savior forever." The words sat heavy in the air. He wanted to tell her again that she didn't need to stay, but something in her voice told him that this wasn't just a choice, it was a binding vow in her culture. "And if I said no?" he asked, curious. She hesitated, then answered, "I would still follow. Until I die." The human sat back, running a hand over his face. This wasn't what he had expected when he pulled her from the water, but before he could say more, she leaned closer and took his hand. "You promise," she said. "You protect me. I serve you. Always." It wasn't a question. It was a declaration. He was about to answer when a sharp knock rattled the cabin door. The sound made her flinch, her fingers tightening around his. He put a finger to his lips, telling her to stay quiet. The knock came again, harder this time. Then a voice, low metallic, speaking in a language he didn't know. But the way her eyes widened in fear told him enough. These were the people she had been running from. The human reached for his rifle, moving silently toward the door. The voice outside kept talking, the tone mocking, almost taunting. She whispered something in her own tongue, quick, desperate, and pointed toward the back of the cabin. There was no other exit, but he knew what she meant, a hidden space under the floorboards. He motioned for her to climb in, and she obeyed without argument. The knock came a third time. Shaking the door on its hinges, once she was hidden, he stood still for a long moment. Then he called out in a casual voice, "Go away, you've got the wrong cabin." The voice outside laughed, a chilling sound. "Human," it said in broken English. "Give us the girl, and we leave you breathing." He didn't answer. Instead, he cocked the rifle and waited. After a tense silence, footsteps crunched away into the snow. But he knew they'd be back. They wouldn't stop until they had her. When it was safe, he lifted the floorboards and helped her out. Her hands were shaking and her breathing was fast. "They will come again," she said, her voice trembling but certain. He nodded. "I know." Then he looked into her eyes. "I promise I won't let them take you," he said. Her breath caught, as if those words meant more to her than he realized. "You promise?" She whispered, "Yes," he said without hesitation, her hands closed around his tightly. "Then I am yours," she said again, with a quiet certainty that made his chest tighten. And in that moment, he realized something. This wasn't just about a law or a cultural vow. This was trust, absolute and unshakable, from someone who had almost lost everything. He had promised to protect her, and now, whether he was ready or not, he would have to keep that promise with his life. The snow had stopped falling, but the air outside the cabin was heavy with silence. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty. It felt like something was listening. The human stepped out slowly, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the white horizon. There were tracks in the snow, deep, wide-set footprints that didn't belong to any animal he knew. They were fresh, no more than an hour old, and they led straight toward the forest line before vanishing into shadow. He went back inside, closing the door quietly. The alien girl sat on the bed, knees tucked under his old coat, her black eyes fixed on him. "They are still here," he said. She didn't need the translation. Her body tensed, and she nodded slowly. "They will not stop," she whispered, her voice barely. Above the crackle of the stove, "They hunt until they have what they want." He crouched beside her. "Tell me why," she hesitated, looking down at her hands. "They took me from my people," she said finally. "They put me in a cage. I was to be sold." Her words were broken, but clear enough to make his stomach turn. She swallowed, her voice growing even quieter. "My kind, we are rare and worth much." The human's jaw tightened. He had heard stories of alien traders capturing sentient beings to sell across the fringe worlds, but hearing it from her, seeing the way her shoulders trembled as she spoke, made his blood run hot. "How did you escape?" he asked. Her eyes flickered to the floor. "They stopped to drink, to laugh. I slipped away. Ran until I found the river." She looked up at him. "Then it should have killed me. But you were there." A distant sound cut through the state. A distant sound cut through the room, a faint hum, mechanical and steady. He moved to the window and peered out at the far edge of the tree line. A shadow shifted. It wasn't an animal. It was a figure, armored and tall, holding something that glinted in the weak light. Another appeared a few steps behind, and then another. 3 hunters, slowly making their way toward the cabin. "They found us," he said. She stood, gripping the edge of the blanket. Her small frame looked even smaller against the firelight, but her eyes were fierce. "You will not give me to them," she said. Not as a question, but a statement. "Never," he replied. He moved quickly, grabbing supplies from shelves, ammunition, a small pack of food, a coil of rope. "We can't stay here," he said. "The forest will give us cover." She followed him to the back wall, where a small hatch led to the outside. It was meant for storing firewood, but now it would be their escape route. As they slipped into the biting cold, the wind carried voices from the front of the cabin. The hunters had reached the door. One of them kicked it open, the sound echoing through the valley. They would see the bed, the empty blankets, the faint steam from the stove. They would know they were close. The human and the girl moved through the snow, their footsteps muffled by the soft crust of ice. She stayed close, her hand gripping his sleeve. Every few seconds he glanced back. Shadows moved between the trees behind them. The hunters had taken the bait and were following. They reached a frozen creek, its surface covered in a thin sheet of ice. He led her along the edge, moving upstream toward a narrow canyon if they could reach it. They could use the high walls to block the hunters' view. But the hum of engines grew louder, not just footsteps now. They had brought a small hover sled, fast and perfect for tracking prey. He stopped, scanning their surroundings. They had minutes at most. "We can't outrun them," he said, thinking. Aloud, her breath came in quick clouds. "Then we make them stop chasing," she said, surprising him with the firmness in her tone. He knew she was right. If they kept running, they'd be hunted until exhaustion finished them. But facing trained mercenaries in the open was suicide, unless... He remembered the narrow bridge in the canyon. If they crossed it first, they could collapse it behind them, cutting off pursuit. "Come on," he said, taking her hand. They pushed forward, snow crunching under their boots. The canyon walls rising ahead, the hunters' voices grew sharper, closer. She stumbled once, and he caught her, lifting her briefly before setting her back on her feet. "Almost there," he said. When they reached the bridge, a rickety stretch of old planks and rope suspended over a deep ravine, the sound of the sled was nearly on top of them. He sent her across first, her small figure darting over the swaying boards. Halfway across, she turned to look at him. "Hurry," she called. He followed. each step making the bridge creak dangerously. Behind him, the hunters broke into view. Weapons raised, he reached the far side and grabbed the axe strapped to his pack. One hard swing into the rope, then another. The bridge gave way with a groan, falling into the shadows below. For the first time since they'd left the cabin, there. With silence again, the hunters stood on the far side. Staring at them across the gap, one raised a fist in a silent threat before turning away. The human knew this wasn't over, but for now, they had bought time. She came to stand beside him, her hand slipping into his. "You kept your promise," she said softly. He looked down at her and nodded. And in that cold, dangerous place, with the enemy still out there, he realized something. Keeping that promise might mean giving up everything, but he would do it without question. The wind picked up again, carrying thin blades of ice across the open ground. The human pulled the old coat tighter around the alien girl's small frame. Making sure the hood covered her silver hair, they had left the broken bridge behind, but the canyon walls only gave them a little protection from the cold. Every step crunched in the snow, and every sound seemed too loud. The hunters might have lost sight of them, but he knew they would not stop. The forest ahead was darker than the one near the cabin. The trees here grew tall and close together, their black trunks leaning like old giants, whispering secrets. The air smelled faintly of sap and frozen earth. It was quieter, too. No birds. No small animals, just the sound of their own footsteps. He didn't like it when the forest was silent. It usually meant something was watching. She walked close beside him, her small hand clutching the side of his jacket, even though the coat was big enough to swallow her whole. The cold still reached her. All right. Her breath came out in small clouds, her eyes darting around at the dark shapes between the trees. "Are we far?" she asked in slow, careful English. "Far enough soon," he answered, though he wasn't sure himself. By midday, the light barely reached the forest floor. They stopped beside a fallen log to rest. He took out a small ration pack, tearing it in half and handing her a piece. She looked at it curiously, sniffed, then took a small bite. Her face softened as she chewed. "You make?" she asked. He shook his head, smiling. "Bought it?" She didn't know the word, but she smiled back anyway. After a few minutes, she began teaching him more words from her language. She pointed at the trees and said a word that sounded like Dren. Then she pointed at the snow and said Vash. When he tried to repeat them, she laughed softly. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh. It was a small sound, but it warmed him more than the fire ever could. The brief moment of peace didn't last. A distant rumble rolled through the forest, low and mechanical. He froze, listening. It wasn't the hover sled this time, but something heavier. Maybe another machine, or maybe a weapon carrier. She stiffened beside him, her laughter gone in an instant. "They come," she whispered. They moved quickly now, weaving between the trees. He led her toward the hills ahead, where a cluster of caves might give them shelter. The snow grew deeper as they climbed. Slowing them down, she stumbled more often, her legs clearly tired. He didn't hesitate. He lifted her onto his back. She wrapped her arms around his neck, her chin resting on his shoulder. "You heavy?" she asked, her voice soft. "Not too heavy," he said. Though his legs burned with each step, when they finally reached the caves, he set her down gently. The entrance was narrow, but inside it widened enough for them to move comfortably. He lit a small lantern and set it on the ground. The glow revealed old marks on the walls, strange carvings, spirals and symbols worn smooth by time. She touched them lightly, whispering something under her breath. "You know what they say?" he asked. She shook her head. "Old. Before my people, they sat together in the glow, eating the last of the rations." The rumble outside faded, replaced by the muffled whisper of snow falling. She leaned against his side, her small frame warm under the coat. "You still promise?" she asked suddenly. He looked down at her, meeting her steady gaze. "Yes," he said, "I still promise." Her shoulders relaxed, and she closed her eyes. For the first time since he had pulled her from the river, she looked like she believed. They might be safe, but he knew better. Safety was only an illusion. The hunters would find the broken bridge, follow their trail into the forest, and search every shadow. And when they came, he would be ready, because keeping his promise wasn't just about protecting her. It was about making sure she never had to run again. That night, as the fire in the small pit flickered low, he heard something outside. It wasn't the sound of the wind or snow shifting. It was a slow, deliberate step, followed by another. He reached for his rifle and motioned for her to stay. Quiet, her eyes opened, wide and alert. A shadow passed across the cave entrance. And then a voice, deep, calm, and far too close, human. "We have been looking for you." The human kept the rifle steady, eyes fixed on the cave entrance. The voice outside was calm, but it carried a weight that meant danger. The alien girl stayed pressed against the wall, her small hands gripping the edge of his coat. The lantern's light flickered, throwing long shadows across the rough stone. He listened for movement, but the snow softened every step, making it hard to tell how many were out there. "Come out, human," the voice called. "Again, you have something that belongs to us." He didn't reply. Instead, he motioned for her to move deeper into the cave. She shook her head quickly, refusing to leave his side. Footsteps crunched closer, slow and deliberate. Then a second voice joined the first, harsher. "She's worth more alive. Don't shoot." "Unless you must." The human felt her shiver against him. He lowered his voice to a whisper. "When I give the signal, you run to the back of the cave." She whispered back, "And you?" "I'll be right behind you," he said, though they both knew he might not be. The first hunter appeared in the entrance, tall, armored, with a visor that reflected the lantern light. A long weapon rested in his hands. Two more shapes followed. Behind, blocking the only exit, the human stepped forward, placing himself between them and the girl. "She's not yours," he said firmly. The lead hunter tilted his head. "She's property, human." "You can't change that." Before the man could answer, the second hunter raised his weapon. The human fired first. The rifle's shot cracking through the cave like thunder. The second hunter fell, his body hitting the ground with a heavy thud. The other two rushed forward, their boots scraping against stone. The human fired again. But the leader moved fast, the shot grazing his armor. The girl pressed herself against the wall, her eyes wide, her gaze darted to the back of the cave. The path he had told her to take, but she didn't move. Instead, she took a deep breath and stepped forward. Her voice rang out, high and sharp, speaking in her own language. The sound was unlike anything the human had heard before. It started as a cry, then rose into a piercing note that made the air vibrate. The hunters froze, their visors flickering. With static, the lead one staggered. Dropping his weapon, the other clutched his head. Stumbling back toward the entrance, the human felt the sound in his bones, rattling his teeth. But it didn't hurt him the way it hurt them. He realized then, this was her hidden weapon, not something physical, but a voice strong enough to break machines and minds alike. She stopped suddenly, gasping for breath. The two remaining hunters were on the ground, disoriented and struggling. To move, the human didn't waste the moment. He kicked the fallen weapon away and stepped to the entrance, rifle aimed. "Stay down," he warned, his voice low and cold. The hunters groaned but didn't rise. He backed into the cave, keeping the rifle ready. The girl's hands were trembling, her face pale. He knelt beside her. "You should have run," he said softly. She shook her head. "I promised to," she whispered. Her words hit him harder than he expected. They gathered what little they had left and stepped out into the snow. The wind had picked up again, carrying fine ice crystals through the air. He led her along the side of the hill, away from the downed hunters. The world around them was quiet again, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way. The hunters would recover, and next time, they'd be ready for her voice. As they moved, she walked closer than before, her small hand gripping his sleeve. She didn't speak, but her gaze stayed fixed ahead. Her steps were steady now, no longer stumbling. The human felt the weight of what had just happened. She wasn't just someone he had to protect. She was someone who could fight. But the cost of using that power was clear in the way she leaned against him. Exhausted when they reached a ridge, he paused to scan the horizon far below. The forest stretched like a dark sea under the fading light. Beyond it lay the settlements, and maybe, just maybe, safety. But there was no guarantee the hunters would follow until they either caught her or were stopped for good. He looked down at her. "We'll make it," he said. More for her than for himself. Her eyes met his, and she gave a faint smile. "As long as you promise," she said, and he did. Without hesitation, because now the promise was no longer just words. It was the reason he would keep moving, keep fighting, and never let her go. The snow was falling again, soft flakes drifting through the quiet night. The human and the tiny alien girl walked side by side, their tracks winding across the white hills. The cold bit into his cheeks, but he ignored it, keeping his focus on the horizon. Every step forward was one more step away from the hunters, but he knew the danger wasn't gone, only distant. The girl stayed close, her small hand gripping his coat. She hadn't spoken much since they left the ridge. The fight in the cave had taken a lot out of her. Every now and then, she would glance up at him as if checking that he was still there, and every time, he gave her the same steady nod, a silent reminder that he wasn't going anywhere. By dawn, they reached the edge of the forest. Beyond it lay open plains, stretching toward a faint glow in the distance. "That way," he said, pointing. She tilted her head. "Safe." He hesitated, then said, "Safer than here." They moved quickly. The crunch of snow under their boots, the only sound halfway across the plain. She stopped suddenly. He turned, scanning the horizon in the distance. 3 dark shapes were moving. "Too fast to be animals, they come," she said quietly. The human's heart pounded. The hunters had found them sooner than he'd expected. There was no cover here, nowhere to hide, he thought fast, scanning the landscape. To their right, a narrow ravine cut through the plain, its edges steep but climbable. "This way," he said. Grabbing her hand, they ran, their breath clouding in the frigid air. The sound of engines grew louder behind them when they reached the ravine. He helped her down the icy slope. The bottom was narrow, the walls high enough to hide them from view. For a moment, it felt like they had a chance. But the voices came again. Echoing down into the ravine, the hunters were close, their footsteps sending small showers of snow from above. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. "You can leave me." "Ah, they want me, not you," she said. He shook his head sharply. "I told you before. I'm not leaving you." The sound of sliding boots made him turn. One of the hunters had dropped into the ravine ahead, blocking their path. Another landed behind them, cutting off escape. The leader's visor gleamed in the pale light. "Last chance, human," he said. "Give her up, and you live." The human stepped in front of her. Raising his rifle, "She's mine," he said, the words coming out cold and certain. The hunter tilted his head. "Yours." "She's property." "No," the human said. "She's family." The first shot rang out. Echoing through the ravine, the human fired again, forcing the front hunter back. The one behind lunged forward. But the girl stepped out from behind him. Her voice rose, that same piercing cry that had saved them before. The hunters staggered, their weapons clattering to the ground. The human didn't waste the moment. He grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the far end of the ravine. they climbed quickly, the snow sliding under their boots. Behind them, the hunters shouted, but their voices were muffled, weakened by her scream. When they reached the top, the plain stretched ahead. Empty and wide, in the far distance, he could see the walls of a settlement. Faint against the horizon, he glanced at her. Almost there, he said. She looked toward the settlement. Then back at him. You promise? Forever? She asked, her voice quiet but certain. He nodded. Forever. As they walked, the glow of the settlement grew brighter. The wind eased, and the snow fell lighter. For the first time since pulling her from the river, he felt like they might truly make it. The hunters were still out there, but they had survived every time. And as long as they stayed together, they always would. When they finally reached the gates, a guard stepped forward. The human spoke quietly to him, and the guard nodded, opening the way. Inside, warm light spilled from windows, and the air smelled faintly of cooked food. The girl's grip on his hand didn't loosen. She looked around, wide-eyed, but her focus always came back to him that night. In the safety of a small room inside the settlement, she sat beside him, wrapped in a thick blanket. Her silver hair caught the firelight, her eyes deep and calm. You saved me from the river, she said slowly. Yes, he replied. And from them, yes, she took a breath, her voice barely more than a whisper. Then you are mine, forever, he smiled, feeling the weight of every moment they had shared. Yours, he said. Outside, the snow fell quietly over the plains, covering their tracks. But no matter where the galaxy pulled them next, they would face it together, because the promise had been made. And promises once given could never be broken. Asterisk.